They stuck her behind a desk, said it was safer, cleaner, more appropriate. She filed papers while others trained with rifles. But when the sirens wailed and the base came under attack, she didn't wait for orders. She sprinted past the chaos, grabbed a rifle from the armory, and joined the front lines. With zero hesitation, she covered evacuations, held defensive lines, and neutralized threats like she'd been doing it for years. When the dust cleared, her CO asked, "Where did you learn to move like that?" She simply replied, "Not everything worth knowing comes from behind a desk." From which city in the world are you watching this video today? If you enjoy stories that prove talent can't be buried by bureaucracy, consider subscribing for more content that shows how true ability always finds a way to shine. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead in the sterile administrative building at Joint Base Lewis McChord when Captain Diana Phoenix Chong first received the orders that would strip away everything she had worked for during 8 years of distinguished military service. At 1,430 hours on a rain-soaked Thursday afternoon in Washington state, the gray Pacific Northwest sky seemed to mirror the devastating blow that was about to end her career as a combat pilot and relegate her to paperwork processing in what amounted to military exile disguised as administrative reassignment. Joint Base Lewis McChord represented one of the largest and most important military installations on the West Coast, housing multiple branches of service and serving as a staging area for deployments throughout the Pacific region. The base sprawled across nearly 90,000 acres of Washington terrain that included airfields, training ranges, and administrative facilities that supported over 40,000 military personnel and their families who called the installation home. The administrative building where Chong received her reassignment orders stood in stark contrast to the flight line where she had spent the majority of her military career flying F-16 Fighting Falcons in missions that ranged from training exercises to combat operations in multiple theaters of conflict. The building's sterile environment of cubicles, filing cabinets, and computer terminals represented everything that Chong had joined the Air Force to avoid: bureaucratic routine that had nothing to do with the mission of defending American interests through air power and combat effectiveness. Captain Chong had earned her pilot wings 8 years earlier after graduating at the top of her class from the Air Force Academy and completing flight training with distinction that had marked her as one of the most promising young pilots in her generation. Her academic performance had been exceptional, graduating summa cum laude with a double major in aeronautical engineering and computer science, while her leadership positions during her cadet years had demonstrated the kind of natural authority and tactical thinking that the Air Force sought in its future officers. Her flight training scores had ranked in the top 5% of her class, with instructor evaluations that consistently praised her analytical approach to complex flight scenarios, her ability to maintain composure under pressure, and her innovative solutions to tactical problems that challenged conventional thinking. The instructors who had trained her predicted that she would become one of the Air Force's premier combat pilots, capable of excelling in the most demanding operational environments. Her initial assignment to the 388th Fighter Wing at Hill Air Force Base had validated those assessments, with Chong quickly establishing herself as one of the squadron's most capable pilots. Her performance during weapons training, tactical exercises, and deployment preparations had earned recognition from squadron commanders who valued her combination of technical expertise and tactical creativity. Her combat record included 2 deployments to the Middle East, where she had flown over 120 missions in support of operations that had directly contributed to mission success and the safety of American ground forces operating in hostile territory. Her missions had included close air support for troops in contact, interdiction strikes against enemy supply lines, and defensive counter-air operations that protected coalition forces from enemy air attacks. During her first deployment, Chong had distinguished herself during a particularly challenging close air support mission that had required precise targeting in an urban environment where enemy forces were intermingled with civilian populations. Her ability to identify and engage valid military targets while avoiding civilian casualties had saved the lives of surrounded American soldiers while maintaining the rules of engagement that governed coalition operations. The mission had taken place in a densely populated area of Baghdad where American ground forces had been ambushed by insurgent fighters who had positioned themselves in buildings that also contained civilian families. The tactical situation required air support that could eliminate the insurgent threat without causing civilian casualties that could undermine coalition efforts to win popular support from the Iraqi population. Chang had spent over 40 minutes orbiting the target area while coordinating with ground forces to identify enemy positions and ensure that her attacks would not endanger civilians. Her patience and tactical restraint had enabled her to develop a solution that eliminated the insurgent threat through precisely targeted strikes that avoided civilian areas while providing the ground forces with the support they needed to break out of the ambush. Her success in that mission had earned her the Distinguished Flying Cross, one of the Air Force's highest decorations for aerial achievement, with a citation that praised her exceptional skill, courage, and dedication to the protection of American ground forces while maintaining the highest standards of precision and restraint in a complex urban combat environment. Her second deployment had included participation in a major air campaign against enemy forces that were threatening coalition supply lines and staging areas. Chang had flown interdiction missions against enemy transportation networks, supply depots, and command facilities that supported insurgent operations throughout the region. During one particularly significant mission, Chang had been part of a strike package that attacked a major enemy logistics facility that was coordinating weapons and personnel movement throughout the theater of operations. The facility was heavily defended by surface-to-air missiles and anti-aircraft artillery that created a high-threat environment requiring careful planning and precise execution. Chang's role in the mission had been to suppress enemy air defenses while other aircraft attacked the primary target. Her suppression attacks had been so effective that the entire strike package was able to complete their mission without losses, despite flying through what intelligence had assessed as one of the most dangerous air defense environments in the theater. Her performance during that mission had earned her multiple air medals and recognition from wing commanders who understood that her tactical competence and courage under fire had been crucial factors in the mission's success. The mission had also demonstrated her ability to function effectively as part of complex air operations that required coordination between multiple aircraft and precise timing under dangerous conditions. But her distinguished combat record and exceptional performance evaluations had not protected her from the career-ending consequences of an incident during a training exercise that had resulted in her being accused of violating direct orders and endangering fellow pilots through what senior officers characterized as reckless and insubordinate behavior that demonstrated unfitness for continued service in operational flying positions. The incident that had destroyed Chang's career had occurred during a complex training exercise known as Red Flag, conducted at Nellis Air Force Base in Nevada. Red Flag was the Air Force's premier combat training exercise, designed to provide realistic combat experience for aircrews who would deploy to operational theaters where they would face sophisticated enemy threats and complex tactical scenarios. The exercise involved multiple aircraft from different units conducting coordinated attacks against simulated enemy targets while avoiding simulated surface-to-air missiles and enemy fighter aircraft that were attempting to prevent mission success. The scenarios were designed to replicate the stress and confusion of actual aerial warfare while providing training that could mean the difference between life and death during real combat operations. Chang had been assigned as the flight leader for a four-ship formation of F-16s, conducting a strike mission against a high-value target that was defended by sophisticated surface-to-air missile systems and enemy fighter aircraft. The mission required careful coordination between multiple aircraft while maintaining situational awareness and tactical flexibility that would allow adaptation to changing threat conditions. During the exercise, Chang had observed what she believed to be a serious safety violation that could have resulted in a mid-air collision between two friendly aircraft whose pilots appeared to be unaware of each other's proximity due to communication failures and navigational errors that had placed them on converging flight paths at the same altitude and airspeed. Her assessment of the situation had indicated that immediate action was necessary to prevent a catastrophic accident that could have resulted in the loss of both aircraft and the deaths of two experienced pilots, whose families would be devastated by preventable training accidents. The collision potential was developing rapidly, with only seconds remaining before the aircraft would reach the point where collision avoidance would become impossible. Chang had attempted to communicate the danger to both pilots through standard radio procedures, broadcasting warnings on the exercise frequency and attempting to establish direct contact with both aircraft to alert them to the collision potential. But communication interference from the electronic warfare environment that was part of the exercise scenario had prevented her warnings from being received and acknowledged by the pilots who were approaching collision course. The electronic warfare simulation included radio jamming that was designed to replicate the communication challenges that pilots would face during actual combat operations where enemy forces would attempt to disrupt coalition communications and command and control systems. The jamming created realistic training conditions, but also created genuine safety hazards when it prevented communication of critical safety information. With seconds remaining before potential impact and no response to her radio warnings, Chang had made the split-second decision to take direct action that would force both aircraft to maneuver away from each other, preventing the collision but violating exercise protocols and direct orders from exercise controllers who were managing the overall training scenario. Chang had maneuvered her F-16 into the flight path between the two converging aircraft, forcing both pilots to take immediate evasive action to avoid colliding with her aircraft. The maneuver had successfully separated the aircraft and prevented what flight data later confirmed would have been a collision that could have resulted in the destruction of both aircraft and the deaths of both pilots. But her intervention had violated exercise protocols that prohibited participants from deviating from assigned flight paths and altitudes without permission from exercise controllers. More seriously, her actions had violated direct orders from the exercise director, who had specifically instructed all participants to maintain their assigned positions and not to take unauthorized action that could disrupt the training scenario. The exercise controllers had been monitoring the developing collision potential through radar systems and had been preparing to issue course corrections that would have separated the aircraft without requiring participant intervention. Chang's unauthorized maneuver had occurred before the controllers could issue their corrections, preventing them from testing whether their safety procedures would have been effective. From the perspective of exercise officials, Chang's intervention had demonstrated a lack of faith in safety procedures and chain of command authority that could not be tolerated in military operations where unit effectiveness depended on strict adherence to orders and procedures. Her violation of direct orders, regardless of her intentions, had set a precedent that could undermine discipline and command authority in situations where those factors were essential for mission success and personnel safety. The incident had immediately resulted in Chang being removed from the exercise and subjected to investigation that would determine whether formal charges would be filed under the Uniform Code of Military Justice. The investigation had focused on her violation of direct orders and exercise protocols rather than her prevention of a potential fatal accident. Military prosecutors had argued that her actions, regardless of their outcome, had demonstrated a pattern of insubordination and poor judgment that made her unsuitable for continued service in positions requiring adherence to strict command authority and operational procedures. They had emphasized that military effectiveness depended on trust in command structures and procedures, and that individual officers could not be allowed to substitute their judgment for that of properly constituted authority. Chang's defense had argued that her actions had been justified by emergency circumstances that required immediate intervention to prevent loss of life, and that her violation of exercise protocols had been necessary to fulfill her higher obligation to protect fellow pilots from imminent danger. Her defense team had emphasized that the preservation of life took precedence over administrative procedures and that her quick thinking had prevented a tragedy. But the military justice system had prioritized adherence to command authority and operational procedures over the results of her intervention. The court-martial had focused on the precedent that would be set if officers were allowed to violate direct orders based on their personal assessment of situations, regardless of the outcomes of their actions. The proceedings had included testimony from exercise officials who explained that safety procedures were in place to handle exactly the type of situation that Chang had encountered, and that her intervention had prevented them from testing and validating those procedures. They had argued that her lack of confidence in established safety measures demonstrated unsuitability for continued service in positions requiring trust in command structures. Testimony had also been provided by pilots who had been involved in the near collision, both of whom had stated that they had been aware of each other's positions and were prepared to take evasive action if necessary. Their testimony had suggested that Chang's assessment of collision potential had been incorrect and that her intervention had been unnecessary. The court-martial had resulted in her conviction on charges of insubordination and violation of direct orders, leading to her reduction in rank from captain to first lieutenant, loss of flight status, and reassignment to administrative duties that would continue for the remainder of her military service commitment. The punishment had effectively ended her flying career while keeping her in the military under conditions that amounted to professional exile. The sentence had been designed to send a clear message to other officers that individual initiative could not substitute for adherence to command authority and established procedures, regardless of the officer's qualifications or intentions. Chang's case had become an example of the consequences that would result from failure to follow orders and trust in command structures. "Lieutenant Chang," said Colonel Robert Stevens as he delivered the reassignment orders that would relocate her to administrative duties in the base personnel office. "Your new assignment will involve processing personnel records, managing administrative correspondence, and supporting clerical functions that are essential to base operations but don't require flight status or operational flying experience." The assignment was clearly designed as punishment rather than utilization of her capabilities, placing a combat-experienced pilot with advanced training and exceptional performance record in a position that could have been filled by someone with minimal military experience and no specialized training. The reassignment sent a clear message that her military career was over except for the minimum service time required to fulfill her commitment. Chang accepted the assignment without protest, understanding that any resistance would only result in additional punishment and potentially more severe consequences for her future prospects both within and outside the military. She had already lost her flying career and her rank. Further confrontation would only jeopardize her ability to complete her service commitment and receive the benefits and recommendations that might help her transition to civilian employment. The administrative office where Chang was assigned reflected the mundane nature of her new duties: rows of desks equipped with computer terminals, filing cabinets containing personnel records, and forms processing systems that manage the bureaucratic requirements of maintaining a large military installation. Her work involved data entry, file management, and routine correspondence that required no special skills or expertise beyond basic computer literacy and attention to detail. For 6 months, Chang performed her administrative duties with the same professional competence that had characterized her flying career, but without the satisfaction and sense of purpose that had motivated her military service. She processed personnel records, maintained filing systems, and completed routine tasks that were necessary for base operations, but provided no opportunity to utilize her training, experience, or capabilities in meaningful ways. The other personnel in the administrative office treated her with the professional courtesy required by military regulations, but there was an underlying awareness that she was not voluntarily assigned to administrative duties and that her presence represented some form of disciplinary action or career failure. Her combat decorations and flying experience were known but irrelevant to her current position, creating an awkward dynamic that emphasized her fall from operational flying to clerical work. But Chang used her time in administrative assignment to study base operations, security procedures, and emergency response protocols that govern how the installation would respond to various threats or crisis situations. Her analytical mind, trained by years of tactical thinking and mission planning, automatically processed information about base vulnerabilities, defensive capabilities, and operational procedures that most administrative personnel never considered. Her access to personnel records and operational reports provided insights into base security that revealed potential weaknesses in defensive arrangements and emergency response procedures. Chang noted patterns in personnel assignments, training schedules, and operational activities that could be exploited by hostile forces seeking to attack or infiltrate the installation. More concerning was her observation that emergency response procedures relied heavily on predetermined protocols that might not be adequate for dealing with sophisticated attacks that exceeded the scenarios used in exercise planning. The base's defensive preparations were designed to counter conventional threats rather than innovative tactics that determined adversaries might employ to achieve maximum impact with limited resources. Chang's concerns about base security were heightened by intelligence reports that indicated hostile forces were conducting surveillance and reconnaissance of American military installations, seeking vulnerabilities that could be exploited through terrorist attacks or sabotage operations designed to inflict casualties and damage morale. The threats were considered credible enough to warrant increased security measures, but specific timing and targeting remained unknown. Her analytical review of base security measures had identified several potential vulnerabilities that could be exploited by sophisticated attackers who understood American defensive procedures and operational patterns. These vulnerabilities included predictable personnel movement patterns, communication systems that could be disrupted through electronic warfare, and defensive positions that could be bypassed through careful route selection. Chang had documented her security concerns in detailed reports that she had submitted through appropriate channels, but her recommendations had been largely ignored by security officials who viewed her as an administrative clerk whose opinions on tactical matters were not credible or relevant. Her loss of flight status and assignment to clerical duties had undermined her credibility, even though her tactical knowledge and analytical capabilities remained intact. The crisis came on a Tuesday morning in October when base security detected multiple unidentified aircraft approaching the installation at low altitude and high speed, following flight paths that suggested coordinated attack rather than navigational error or mechanical emergency. The aircraft appeared to be conducting a sophisticated assault that had been planned to exploit weaknesses in base defensive measures. All personnel, this is base security, announced the emergency alert system that activated throughout the installation. Condition Red is now in effect. All personnel report to designated protective positions. This is not a drill. Repeat, this is not a drill. Chang was in the administrative office when the alert sounded, surrounded by civilian employees and military personnel whose emergency training had prepared them to seek shelter and await further instructions rather than take active defensive measures. The emergency procedures for administrative personnel emphasized protection and evacuation rather than engagement with hostile forces. But Chang's training and instincts were those of a combat pilot who had been conditioned to respond to threats with aggressive action rather than passive protection. Her analysis of the threat indicated that the approaching aircraft posed immediate danger to base personnel and facilities, and that conventional defensive measures might not be adequate to prevent significant casualties and damage. Through the office windows, Chang could observe the flight patterns of the approaching aircraft, which appeared to be conducting attack runs against critical facilities including the flight line, fuel storage areas, and personnel concentration points. Her combat experience allowed her to assess their tactics and predict their likely targets based on approach angles and flight characteristics. Those aircraft are positioning for coordinated attacks on the flight line and fuel storage, Chang announced to the administrative personnel around her. They're using attack profiles that I recognize from combat operations. This isn't reconnaissance. This is preparation for strikes designed to cause maximum damage and casualties. The other personnel in the office looked at her with expressions that ranged from confusion to skepticism, uncertain whether to trust the assessment of someone who had been demoted and reassigned to administrative duties. Her loss of rank and flight status had undermined her credibility, even though her combat experience and tactical knowledge remained intact. But Chang wasn't waiting for authorization or agreement from people who lacked the training and experience necessary to assess the tactical situation developing outside their windows. She could see that base defensive measures were focused on conventional responses that might not be effective against aircraft employing tactics that she recognized from her combat experience. I'm going to the flight line, Chang announced as she headed toward the door. Those defensive positions need someone who understands air-to-air combat tactics and can coordinate more effective responses to this attack. Lieutenant Chang, you're not authorized to leave your assigned position during emergency conditions, called out the administrative supervisor, a career civil servant who understood bureaucratic procedures but had no experience with combat operations or tactical decision-making under crisis conditions. People are going to die if someone doesn't provide tactical coordination, Chang replied without stopping. My responsibility to protect American lives is more important than my administrative assignment. Chang left the administrative building and moved toward the flight line, where she could observe the approaching aircraft and assess defensive measures that were being implemented by base security forces. Her movement violated emergency procedures and direct orders to remain in protective positions, but her tactical assessment indicated that conventional defensive measures would be inadequate against the coordinated attack that was developing. The flight line was in chaos as maintenance personnel and aircrew attempted to secure aircraft and equipment while taking protective cover from anticipated air attacks. The defensive measures being implemented were appropriate for conventional ground attacks, but were not optimized for defending against coordinated airstrikes by multiple aircraft employing sophisticated attack tactics. Chang reached the base operations center where defensive coordination was being managed by personnel who understood base security procedures but lacked experience with air-to-air combat tactics and air defense operations. Their responses were following predetermined protocols that had been developed for different types of threats and might not be effective against the current attack. Those aircraft are using coordinated attack tactics, Chang explained to the operations personnel who were managing the defensive response. They're positioning for simultaneous strikes from multiple directions that will overwhelm point defenses and cause maximum damage to critical facilities. The operations personnel looked at her with suspicion and confusion, uncertain why a demoted administrative clerk was providing tactical analysis during a crisis situation. Her loss of rank and assignment to clerical duties had created perception that she lacked credibility or authority to contribute to operational decision-making. "Lieutenant, you're not authorized to be in this facility during emergency operations," said Major Wilson, who was coordinating the defensive response. "Return to your administrative assignment and follow emergency procedures for non-essential personnel." But Chang could see through the operations center windows that the attacking aircraft were beginning their attack runs, using tactics that she recognized as designed to achieve maximum surprise and damage against defenders who were not positioned effectively to counter coordinated air attacks. The defensive measures being implemented would not prevent significant casualties and damage to critical base facilities. "Sir, those aircraft are about to begin coordinated strikes against the fuel storage area and aircraft parking areas," Chang persisted. "If they succeed, the resulting explosions and fires will cause casualties that could be prevented through different defensive positioning and tactical coordination." Major Wilson hesitated, torn between following protocols that required Chang to return to her administrative assignment and recognizing that her tactical analysis might provide valuable insights for defending against an attack that was unlike any scenario covered in standard emergency procedures. Her combat experience and flight training might offer perspectives that could enhance defensive effectiveness. The decision was made for him when the first attacking aircraft began its strike run against the fuel storage facility, using approach tactics that Chang had predicted and following attack profiles that validated her tactical analysis. The aircraft's approach confirmed that this was a coordinated attack employing sophisticated tactics rather than random action by inexperienced pilots. "All defensive positions, this is base operations," Major Wilson transmitted over the emergency communication system. "Lieutenant Chang is providing tactical coordination for air defense. Follow her directions for repositioning and defensive fire coordination." Chang immediately began coordinating defensive measures that utilized her understanding of air-to-air combat tactics and attack procedures. Her instructions to defensive positions were designed to create overlapping fields of fire that would force attacking aircraft into defensive maneuvers rather than allowing them to complete uncontested attack runs against their targets. "Defensive position Alpha, shift your fire zone 15 degrees left," Chang directed over the communication system. "The lead aircraft will attempt to avoid your current position by banking right into the coverage zone of defensive position Bravo. Coordinate your fire to force him into a climbing turn that will expose him to defensive position Charlie." Her tactical coordination transformed the base's defensive response from reactive measures that responded to attacks after they occurred to proactive measures that anticipated attack patterns and positioned defensive fires to disrupt enemy tactics before they could achieve their objectives. The coordination required understanding of both defensive and offensive air tactics that Chang possessed from her combat experience. For the next 27 minutes, Chang coordinated the base's air defense against a sophisticated attack that involved 6 aircraft employing tactics designed to overwhelm conventional defensive measures and inflict maximum damage on critical facilities. Her tactical expertise and combat experience enabled defensive measures that prevented the attackers from achieving their primary objectives while inflicting casualties on attacking forces. Defensive Position Delta. Lead aircraft is beginning a climbing turn to avoid your fire. Chang continued to coordinate. Position Echo. Prepare to engage as he completes his turn and attempts to egress toward the northwest. Position Foxtrot. Be ready to engage the second aircraft that's positioning for attack on the operations center. The attacking aircraft found their tactics anticipated and countered by defensive measures that forced them into increasingly desperate maneuvers to avoid defensive fire while attempting to complete their attack missions. Chang's coordination created a defensive network that transformed the base from a target to be attacked into a lethal environment that threatened any aircraft attempting hostile action. Her defensive coordination was so effective that the attacking aircraft were unable to complete their primary mission objectives, with 3 aircraft being destroyed by defensive fire and the remaining aircraft withdrawing without causing significant damage to critical base facilities. The successful defense was attributed to tactical coordination that had anticipated enemy tactics and positioned defensive measures to counter sophisticated attack procedures. Outstanding tactical coordination, Major Wilson said as the emergency situation was declared over and normal base operations resumed. Your air defense coordination prevented what could have been a catastrophic attack that would have caused significant casualties and damage to critical facilities. Chang's performance during the crisis had demonstrated tactical expertise and leadership capability that had been suppressed but not eliminated by her administrative assignment. Her combat experience and flight training had provided insights that proved crucial for defending against an attack that conventional defensive procedures could not have effectively countered. But more importantly, her actions during the crisis had been recorded by base security systems and communication equipment that provided objective documentation of her tactical decision-making and coordination effectiveness under pressure. The recordings would prove that her court-martial conviction had been based on incomplete understanding of her capabilities and judgment. The investigation that followed the attack revealed that Chang's tactical coordination had been the decisive factor in the successful defense of the base, and that her violation of emergency procedures to provide that coordination had prevented casualties and damage that could have resulted from inadequate defensive measures. Her unauthorized actions had saved lives and protected critical facilities. More significantly, the investigation included review of her original court-martial case and the training exercise incident that had led to her conviction and demotion. Flight data from the exercise was re-examined using more sophisticated analysis techniques that revealed details that had not been available during the original investigation. The reanalysis confirmed that Chang's intervention during the training exercise had prevented a collision that would have resulted in the loss of both aircraft and the deaths of both pilots. The flight data showed that the pilots had been on a collision course and were unaware of each other's proximity due to communication failures and navigational errors that had not been adequately considered during the original investigation. The flight data clearly shows that Lieutenant Chang's intervention prevented a fatal collision, explained Colonel Patricia Morrison, who conducted the post-attack investigation. Her violation of exercise protocols was justified by emergency circumstances that required immediate action to prevent loss of life. The investigation also revealed that the exercise controller's safety procedures would not have been effective in preventing the collision, as their radar systems had not detected the developing collision potential with sufficient time to issue course corrections. Chang's visual assessment of the situation had been more accurate than the electronic systems that exercise officials had relied upon. The investigation recommended that Chang's court-martial conviction be overturned and that her rank and flight status be restored based on evidence that her actions had been correct and necessary under the circumstances. The recommendation acknowledged that the original investigation had been flawed and that Chang had been wrongly convicted and punished. Chang's vindication led to her promotion back to captain and restoration of her flight status, with assignment to a position that recognized her tactical expertise and leadership capability. Her experience during the base attack had demonstrated that her combat skills and judgment remained superior despite months of administrative assignment that had attempted to bury her capabilities. But Chang's restoration was about more than personal vindication. It represented recognition that the military justice system had failed to properly evaluate her actions and had punished someone whose judgment and capabilities were exactly what the military needed in crisis situations. Her case became a model for ensuring that investigations considered all relevant factors before making decisions that could destroy careers. The base attack and Chang's role in defending against it became a case study used in military leadership training and air defense courses throughout the Air Force. Her tactical coordination during the crisis demonstrated principles that were incorporated into defensive procedures and emergency response protocols at installations worldwide. Her influence on military training extended beyond tactical coordination to include recognition that personnel who had been disciplined or demoted might still possess valuable capabilities that could be crucial during crisis situations. Her case led to policy changes that ensured that disciplinary actions were based on complete understanding of circumstances and that valuable personnel were not wasted through inappropriate assignments. Years later, when Chang had been promoted to colonel and commanded her own fighter wing, she would reflect on the lesson that talent and capability could not be permanently suppressed by bureaucratic action or administrative assignment. Her experience had demonstrated that true ability would find ways to contribute to mission success regardless of official position or recognition. Because sometimes the person who saves everyone is the one whose talents were buried by bureaucracy but could not be destroyed by administrative exile. And sometimes the greatest victories come from those who were written off by the system but refused to let that system define their worth or limit their contribution to something greater than themselves.